the term gamification, how do you broadly define it as something that's taken over so many sectors over the past few decades? I mean, rating Uber drivers is an example that you give right off the bat, but to start more broadly, how do you define that term?
Yeah, I mean, gamification is pretty broad. It basically means using ideas from game design, from video games, in non-game purposes. So maybe using ideas like badges, points, missions, levels, quests for education, for the workplace, for fitness, all sorts of things. So it's pretty broad, but I think a lot of people, when they see it, they recognize it.
And yeah, so there's some hallmarks of it: achievement points, right? Stars, or I guess different things you can accumulate, all that kind of stuff. And I mean, how is this in any way really like different, at least from the workplace side, from traditional performance review?
Yeah, I mean, workplaces, factories, a lot of institutions have always wanted to monitor workers' performance. Over the years, that's not a new thing. It's been around for centuries, if not millennia. And they've always had some way of rewarding or punishing workers for their performance. So, in that respect, it's not new. I think there's kind of two things that have really changed in the last 10 to 20 years. The first part is that the level of monitoring is just much more detailed and just completely non-stop compared to the past, right? It might be that you're rated on your output over a day. They just count up how much work how many pieces you've completed in a day. Now, if you work at Amazon, if you work at Uber, a lot of companies, call centers, they can monitor your performance down to the second, and they can see, literally where you're moving, what things you're clicking. So that's kind of being able to monitor you. And I think what's interesting about gamification is how they feed back on your performance. So it used to be in the past, you get a little letter in the mail saying you need to work harder, otherwise you're fired. Or a manager might come up to you, and have a chat with you. And now, increasingly, we're seeing that kind of feedback from bosses and from management come in the form of a game, where it will say, look, you've slipped down this leaderboard, or you haven't gotten these achievements, or you have got these achievements. You're outperforming people on the factory floor. You've completed these quests, and so now you can level up. That is the difference. And so it does have similar roots to Taylorism, to other forms of management, but it's in a very different lens in terms of just how constant it is and how it's dressed up in these kind of clothes of video games.
Right. And can you expand on that fact, how it is a version of electronic surveillance, which we've talked about on this program, but there's a different layer to it. I mean, I know that you have a background as a developer, and you've made arguments for ethical gaming, so you kind of understand what these checkpoints might look like to make it a game, as opposed to just standard electronic monitoring. What are some of those indicators?
Well, I think it's a bit of a family resemblance. So, but one example would be, how you talk about the work, right? So instead of saying, okay, here's your assignment for today, here's your quest for today, and it is shown using kind of graphics, pixel art or achievement badges that we've seen from games. I think there are elements like competition, so where you are competing against other people, your colleagues, for space on a leaderboard. I think that there are things like joining rewards or punishments automatically to your performance. So that's kind of a big, a different thing. Usually there is some, in the past, that there's usually some sort of human manager deciding, okay, I think this person has done better or worse. Whereas in a game, of course, we're used to video games being automatic. If you fail this level, that's it. You are instantly punished or rewarded if you pass. So I think those are two kind of big parts of it. And you see that in places like Uber, where they will literally offer drivers quests periodically. And if you accept the quest, then you have to go and, yeah, I mean, that's what they call it. And you have to complete a certain number of trips and carry a certain number of passengers within a time window. And if you do that, then you get a bonus. And that sounds great. Obviously, you think, wow, who wouldn't want extra money? But if you talk to the drivers, if you see what they say, they're like, actually, the problem is that it's not really fair. A lot of the quests you go on, they feel like they're set up to fail. And that's where it becomes different from a traditional board game or video game, which is designed to be fair. With gamification in the workplace, there's no reason why it has to be fair. I mean, they can set up a quest where you're always 1 or 2 trips away from winning. And that's something we've seen people in other countries complain about, delivery drivers and gig economy workers around the world, talk about this sort of thing.
Yeah, the gig economy element is, I really think, is such an important piece because it dresses up the work in a way that obscures the lack of protections or wage increases that should be in place. But to step back a little, I'm hoping that we could trace the origins of this, starting earlier in your book to the early 2000s when I think you talk about Foursquare, other apps like that began this kind of trend. Take us to that point.
Yeah, I mean, gamification is kind of so pervasive now. It's hard to remember that it's actually quite new. The term really started becoming used about 15 years ago, and that is when apps like Foursquare, where people would basically check into real world locations like bars and cafes and museums to let their friends know where they've been. And by checking in, you could get points and rise up a leaderboard and get sometimes real world rewards by becoming the mayor of a location, by being a regular. And Foursquare did really well. It had lots of downloads for the time. And a lot of people thought that the reason why it was successful was because of the gamification. And so you saw a lot of other companies think, okay, well, we've got to add gamification to our product. And it's quite easy to do that because basically you're already tracking all this information, right? If you are a fitness tracker, you're already tracking people's steps. So it's not that hard to develop a system where you give people a badge or leaderboard if they walk 10,000 steps, that sort of thing. And so it started spreading everywhere, really.
Right. And when did that spread kind of begin to trickle into things like workplaces, right? And I guess it started off with a bit of a shine to a degree, right? Where people felt like there was this whole world at their fingertips, and now it's quite rapidly become, I think, an example of a sort of dystopia.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of started in two different places. The first place is really consumer tech. So like, your Fitbit or iPhone apps, things that people choose to install, things like Duolingo. And I think, the worst you can say about them is that maybe they don't work, but at least, you're choosing to go and install them. I think, after that, you started seeing a lot of people say gamification is potentially the way to, just get positive outcomes for anything. So, for example, Obama's 2008 campaign, employed a kind of gamification to encourage volunteers to, call people to get to the polls. And people say, oh, maybe gamification helped that. And so there was just this idea that gamification could be used to do good things. And of course, you had a lot of gamification consultants going around saying, oh, well, wouldn't it be great if we could make the workplace more fun and more engaging, and make workers happier and make them work harder if we took these same tools that make volunteering for political campaigns or making running more interesting and use them in the workplace. And I think people wanted to believe that was true, partly because of like a completely different thing, which is that people want to believe that video games in general are a good thing. I think, there's no mistaking the fact that over the last 10, 20 years, video games, which are already a big business, have become the biggest business in entertainment. They're bigger than Hollywood, bigger than TV, bigger than the music industry. And I think that sort of positive shine around video games has transferred to gamification. And so I think a lot of companies thought, oh, well, this is just a good thing. Why don't we deploy it? It probably doesn't cost that much, and it could save us a lot of money.
And it's one thing, as you say, if consumers are the ones being, quote, gamified, right? Where they're making these decisions, and it might not be, say, good for your brain with some of these, but and that's I'm not saying that about video games largely. I just mean something that like is addictive to a degree. I don't know, but it's a whole different ballgame when it's being used essentially to discipline workers and used to obscure uh, unethical practices by corporations and their employers.
Yeah. I don't think it's great when people sort of download a brain training app and they think it's going to make them smarter, and it doesn't. But
Right.
that's a whole different dimension to you working at a call center and having to install some software on your laptop, which means that even it takes a photo of you every 5 minutes to make sure that you're not you haven't gone away from your computer. And if you aren't there, you get docked points, and that means that you step down the leaderboards. And so I think there's kind of a to me that's not great. I think the other thing that really bothers me as a kind of game designer and just as a human is that I think a lot of people, when they get the feedback about their performance from a game, they think if I failed, it's because it's my fault. Like I haven't been working hard enough, or I'm not good enough. Because when you play a video game or you play a board game and you die, usually it's because, well, you just aren't good enough at the game yet, and you will get better. But as I said before, one of the problems with gamification is that there's no reason why employers have to design their systems in a fair way. They can just make it get harder and harder for everyone every week. That doesn't mean they're doing that, but there's no transparency and there's no reason for them not to do that. And that's the concerning thing.
Absolutely. And it further atomizes or sections off the worker from some sort of human manager to a degree, and it makes it makes employment decisions. I know Amazon, we'll get to them in a bit, but the way that they judge their workers' performance based on these internal algorithms might look outward facingly to the employee like a gaming system, but they're actually making quite cold-hearted decisions internally based on the data that they collect on that individual. And there's still that complete separation. It widens the gap between worker and management. Is that an accurate take largely with some of these gamification systems directed at workers?
Yeah, I mean, I think companies have always been interested in automation, in cutting costs, and I think a lot of managers just hate talking to workers because often, it's nice to give them good news. It's awful to give them bad news, and to sort of have to discipline workers. And so I think one of the things that a game does is it gives you a kind of interface as a manager, as an owner of a company, to reward and punish workers without you having to do it yourself, and without you having to kind of feel even that bad about it, because you're like, well, that's just what the game does, right? And so I think it kind of meshes with the fact that a lot of people spend all their time playing games, as we used to spend time watching TV. And so it kind of makes sense. It's easy to see your workers as these little kind of like non-player characters, as these just icons on a screen, and think, well, like they're just getting on with it. I don't need to worry about it. And yeah, it definitely atomizes, the community there.